Well, first of all, thank you for being here. We know that your schedule is cramped and busy, but we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us and meeting with this group. And if you'd like to just start up, tell us why you're hopeful to do this and what your hopes are for winning this election and what you'd hope to accomplish. And I'm sure they'll have lots of questions.
Sure, great. Well, it's a pleasure to meet with you all. It's good to see you all again. You know my background. Susan and I, this Bozeman's home. We made the decision to make Montana home 24 years ago. We've raised our kids here. Our daughter was born at Deaconess. Rachel, she's now off at college, and hoping to get her back in Montana. We started our business here, Right Now Technologies. Susan and I just had our 29th anniversary this past weekend. So it's a milestone for us.
Yeah.
And we started our business Right Now Technologies together in our home. And you know the story. We started with $5,000 and became Bozeman's largest commercial employer here. And we took that company public in 2004 and then ultimately became part of Oracle, and now they're one of the largest employers. But what I'm really proud of in that is that it started a whole high-tech community here. There was this recent Kaufman report that came out just a couple of weeks ago showing the ecosystem that has kind of spun out of Right Now. I think they identified 16 startups here in the Valley that had direct parental lineage back to Right Now. But in total, we now have over 300 high-tech firms in the state. And I think as I've driven the state, up to 80,000 miles driven, as I mentioned, I've been staying in people's homes. People, their dreams and aspirations are really for high-wage jobs so their kids can stay here and not have to leave. And a concern that there's a lot of federal overreach that's threatening our way of life here in Montana. And to answer your question, Nick, about why am I running, it's clear to me that Montana needs a strong voice back in Washington, D.C. to help bring reform, because Washington's not working, and to protect our precious way of life. And I think a couple of things that qualify for me for that is I'm not a political guy by background. I'm a business guy. I'm an electrical engineer by training. Engineers are trained to solve problems, and another advantage is we actually can do math, which is a skill that's not terribly prevalent back in Washington, D.C. And I think we need to bring some fiscal discipline back there. I've spent my whole life balancing budgets. And one thing that people don't know a lot of is that people think tech firms are all about doing techie things, and that's what we do all day long. Well, in reality, what I've spent most of my career doing is negotiating contracts. Our clients were some of the largest firms in the world, people like American Express and Motorola and Sony, and we actually did work with 170 federal agencies that were clients of ours at Right Now Technologies. And we did, in the last years of the business, say 5 years, we were doing about 1,000 transactions every 90 days. Average transaction for us was about $350,000. We did about 30 deals over $1 million every 90 days, and I was part of many of those. So I've spent my career using my engineering skills to find common ground with some pretty tough customers. And Montana won in the end. And that's kind of my proposition to people in Montana. I'm going to take this pragmatic engineering background, my business experience, and my work experience in negotiating to find common ground and positive outcomes back to DC to be a strong voice for Montana. My motivation is really that I want to serve. We've been blessed, and we've prospered in Montana, and I believe we need more prosperity. And who better to go do it than someone who's experienced it themselves here? So that's it. I had the great pleasure at Right Now Technologies. Steve Daines came to work for us when we were about 100 employees, and we worked side by side for 12 years. And I think that with him in the Senate and me in the House, we've been in the trenches together before for 12 years, that we would make a good pair back there to make sure Montana's interests are represented. And my commitment to people is I'm not coming at this with any particular ideology. I'm coming at this with just a pragmatic problem-solving approach. That's what engineers do. They go collect the data and then they make decisions. So I just, for those watching online, I just said humbly ask for your vote, and I look forward to having a conversation today about the issues.
All right. Let's talk, unless anybody else wants to dive in, I think the big topic certainly is healthcare that we heard from Mr. Quistwood.
Yeah.
He's here, and wanted to get your take on the proposal that's recently passed the House and
Yeah.
what you think of it at this point.
Yeah, so I would not have voted for it because I didn't have enough data yet. I talk about this engineering approach. I do believe that Obamacare is in a death spiral. We've seen premiums go up for Montanans dramatically. I believe we need to repeal and replace it. But for me, there's really a three-way test on any proposal that comes forward. Is first, it's got to reduce premiums for Montanans. Secondly, we've got to protect rural access. And thirdly, we've got to protect people with pre-existing conditions. And you know, the first bill that came in the House, I opposed it because the CBO score said that it would actually drive premiums up. This last case, the reason I said I would not vote for it is we didn't even have a CBO score. We still don't have a CBO score. Until I have a guarantee that's actually going to bring premiums down for Montanans, I don't think we should be repealing it.
How do you ensure rural access to health care in a bill like that?
Yeah, so as I said, I've driven 80,000 miles. I've been in a lot of the critical access hospitals. They are very dependent on Medicaid reimbursements and the rates associated with that. Now, the rates are set at the state level, but there's got to be funds there so they can do that. And we know these critical access hospitals are the lifeblood of these small communities. They go away, and there's many people who are dependent on medical care can't live there anymore. So we need to do that. Ultimately, I don't have all the solutions. What I've committed to do, and this is what an engineer does, we go talk to experts. Healthcare is an important enough issue. It's one of the top 2 or 3 in terms of the people I've spoken with. I plan to put together a healthcare advisory board made up of heads of these rural facilities, doctors, as well as larger employers in the state. I'm convinced, healthcare is such a complicated issue. There's no one single bullet. There's no one single solution. We've got to be looking for any potential program that will do those 3 things I talked about, and rural healthcare is, incredibly important.
So what, in the benefits that we're designing right now, as we were talking before we
Yeah.
started, do you recall, or what kind of controls or policies, guidelines were in place to help manage the cost increases that inevitably had to occur during your tenure there?
Yeah, so right now, we did provide full medical benefits. There was some participatory amount that the employee did, but the company covered the bulk of it. And I think that's an employer's obligation to do that. And we manage costs closely. There are analytics you can get as a corporation to look at transaction patterns on healthcare. Here's a good example. We had a situation where we had a fairly young population at Right Now Technologies, and if somebody goes down to the clinic here in town, a visit might be $100 to $200. You go to the emergency room, it's $1,200 to $1,500, maybe more. Well, we saw a pattern where with no incentives in the system, people would go to the emergency room even for an ear infection or something like that, and it drove up the cost. And we ran a self-insured plan. They didn't get better care at the hospital. In fact, they might even wait longer to get their ear looked at than to go walk in at the clinic. So we changed our plan a little bit to add incentives so they'd use lower cost providers as long as the quality of care was maintained. And I think there's some lessons to be learned in that, because economics matter. If we have a system where, and this is part of the problem, we because of the way malpractice insurance is set up today, there's a lot of defensive medicine that's done. That's one of the issues with Obamacare. It was insurance reform. It didn't deal with the underlying cost structure of healthcare. Malpractice insurance is one area I think we need to look at. Texas has done some interesting things there. We need to maintain people's ability to protect their interests, but we also should be working to eliminate frivolous lawsuits that just drive up the costs for the rest of us. Prescription drugs is another area. I was with a gentleman recently. He needed eye drops. A little eye dropper was $400. The same drops, same manufacturer in Mexico was $39. Something's broken in prescription drugs, and I mean that's the world you lived in, Don.
We
for a
could
long
debate that someday.
Well,
But it's a fair point. It's got out of
yeah, and I'm a free market guy. I really am. And you may or may not agree with me, but if there is price gouging, I mean, a company is entitled to a return on their investments because they spend years going through the approval process. They should be able to make a profit. But when in any industry, whether it's utilities or anything, when we grant a monopoly to a company, it comes with some obligation for fair pricing.
Sure.
So although I tend to be a free market guy, when the government grants a monopoly, I'm okay with regulations to make sure the consumer is protected. And I think we need to look at some common sense measures around prescription drugs because that's not happening today.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, Dave.
I was watching an interview with you, one of the early morning eye-openers on Sunday,
Uh-huh.
with the two poli-sci professors, and you stated that your family's health insurance premium has risen 80% this year. Are you members of the AHCA, the Obamacare, or what? I couldn't figure out what the context was of that 80%.
Yeah, and this is we're not on the exchange. We're in a Blue Cross Blue Shield here in the state, as many people are. But what we've seen, I was giving that. Maybe I'm not expecting you to have any sympathy for me, but many Montana families have seen dramatic increases in premiums, and that was really the point I was trying to make. That whatever we do in healthcare reform has got to bring premiums down because they've just been skyrocketing.
But you had an 80% increase.
82.5%, yes.
Okay. And you still have your under 26 children?
Not all of them. I think one or two are on the policy.
I just found it a really extraordinary figure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in fact, I brought it, it was it wasn't I wasn't planning on mentioning it, but I had gotten the bill like 2 hours earlier, and it's a shocker. It went from like $800 a month to $1,700 a month, and we didn't have a health issue this past year.
Yeah, we had the same experience.
This is what, I mean, the Obamacare, in my view, has taken choice out of the market, and we need to do things like make healthcare, available across state boundaries. We need more choices for consumers, not less. And we've been seeing insurance providers pull out of markets and raise rates dramatically.
So Greg, with your position on the healthcare bill that passed, with the New York Times story that came out that seemed to indicate that wasn't, whether that's true or not, I guess I want to get your thoughts about that, on whether those statements that the New York Times published, if that jives with your position as your.
Yeah, they've been, my comments have been consistent because I said, and I still say this, I'm thankful that we're talking about healthcare back in Washington. And I'm thankful that we're starting to make progress. I would not have voted for the bill.
Okay.
What are your polling numbers say right
now? We've been, I would say I'm encouraged. If nothing's done till you're done. Probably if I had a concern, it's that we've seen an awful lot of money pour into this race. I mean, I think we could all agree there's way too much money in politics, but it's the system we have. And there's been an awful lot of money pouring in from San Francisco and New York into my opponent's race. And honestly, we've gotten money from out of state too. There's a lot of eyes focused on this election. And I'm not sure any Montanans really want people on the coast telling us how to live our lives. And that's some level of concern to me.
So what, as we talked with Mr. Chris the other day, values and Montana values, and that gets bantied about regularly. Well, how do you see Montana values fitting into any of the decisions around healthcare or tax reform, or connect some dots there for me?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, this is what Montanans want. They want a strong voice back in Washington that can represent our interests. And it's probably the #1 issue I've heard as I've toured the state, that there's just, Washington's not working for us. It's like it's been called a swamp. It could be called a cesspool of all these special interests that are feeding themselves as opposed to taking care of us. I have a very different view about the path forward for us than my opponent does. I think, for example, that we should have. Hello.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I had a eye exam this morning. I'm not playing Joe Cool either. They were tight late.
He's playing Joe Cool, it's okay.
Well, I should just be taking.
I already thought you were Joe Cool.
That's right, sorry.
So there are some big differences. I was very pleased to have Chris Cox, the executive director of the NRA, here yesterday. I'm pleased to have their endorsement. I think this is a strong Second Amendment state. Guns are we don't own them, they're just part of our way of life. My opponent has an F rating from the NRA. That goes to Montana values. I think that generally Montanans are very independent, and I think we're not afraid of hard work, and that I think individuals should be able to keep as much of their hard-earned money as possible. That's why I've said, I'm opposed to higher taxes. You won't get higher income taxes from me. You won't get a sales tax from me, although that's a state issue, not a federal issue. My opponent has actually called a 90% personal income tax rate a brilliant idea. I can't imagine working until the third week of November every year until you get to keep any of your own money. It would take incentive out of the system. There's a very different view on the path forward here. Now, I respect his musical ability, but I think we need somebody in Washington that can represent Montana's interests and be a strong voice and negotiate a better deal for Montana.
Don't we have a pretty good deal where we're receiving more Washington dollars than we're paying in? Isn't that a pretty good deal?
We are, but we have to make it easier for Montanans to prosper. We're also 49th in the country in wages, and I think we need to make it easier for small business people and individuals. I think we'd have a stronger economy if we could responsibly develop our natural resources. We've seen, you take forest management as a good example. We used to have a thriving timber industry. We have very limited mills left, and the timber management is part of having healthy forests. If we actually managed our forests, we'd have healthier forests, there'd be more habitat, there'd be more wildlife, there'd be more hunting opportunities. We'd have timber going to our mills, which would create jobs, and we'd have less forest fires. But because of things like the Equal Access to Justice Act, which I don't support repealing it, but I do think it needs to be modified because it's really empowered groups, out-of-state groups mostly, in issuing endless lawsuits that have prevented us from managing our forests. I think more decisions should be made here in the state rather than back in DC. And so there's one example.
I got a follow on that. If Secretary Zinke recommends rescinding the national monument status for Upper Missouri Breaks, what's your position on that?
Yeah, so I think community input is extremely important. And the issue I had with the initial designation is that input was not sought in the communities that were directly affected by it. And I don't have a particular opinion on whether that monument should be there or not. I believe that it's mostly should be dependent on the input of the community. And I'll give you another example where, and this goes to like my engineering approach to problem solving. I am a pro-natural resource development person. We need to protect the environment, but I think we can do that and develop our natural resources here. I've toured most of the mines in the state. But I got a lot of input from Paradise Valley, south of Livingston, about the immigrant and crevice mines. And I share this with you just as an example of how I make decisions. Because I think that's what you're hiring somebody for, is like, can they make reasonable decisions that'll represent Montana's interests? I went and talked to the Democrat county commissioners in Park County. I spoke with the former Republican county commissioners. I spoke with the local legislators, Alan Redfield and Nell Schwandel. I met with the Yellowstone Business Coalition, which is the owner of Chico, and a number of the people that own fly fishing shops and retail shops. And then I went and toured the proposed mine site for the immigrant mine. And what I found in that community was near universal opposition to a mine in that location. And although I am pro-natural resource development, in this particular case, the interests of the community, because I thought a mine there would have negative impact on the existing community, I came out in opposition to that mine. And again, I share that story just as a kind of as an example of how I'm willing to work with all of the interested parties to make the right decision. I think the monuments is another good example. We need to hear from those communities up in the Missouri Breaks.
They have grazing rights on it still, retained in the monument status.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't that a business use of a natural resource too?
It is, but it also comes with other property restrictions, and we just need to balance those.
But if it's recommended for rescission, what are you going to do? It's pretty important.
We need to
tourism in the state.
We need to hear from the community there about what their position is and how it impacts them.
On the Paradise Valley mines, I remember when Tester introduced a bill to permanently withdraw mineral rights on, new mineral rights actually, on the public lands there. You sent me a statement, something along the lines of, you want to ensure the bill, excuse me, protects private property rights.
Mm-hmm.
Since this is a bill focused entirely on public land, what private property rights are you talking about? What do you see as the possibility?
Yeah, there are existing, it's not the right place for a mine. Mm-hmm. The challenge, I believe, with I agree with the sentiment of Tester's bill, but to get it passed, you need bipartisan support in the House and the Senate. I think there are, and I don't think that bill in its form can get approved, because you have to build that consensus. I'm all about getting stuff done. There are existing property rights associated with claims up in Immigrant Gulch and up in the Crevice Mine area. Now those mines really can't operate without access to adjacent ore that's on public property. If we were to pass a bill that shuts down mining, which I am supportive of, that's not the right place for a mine. We need to address those private property rights.
I think Tester has said, and I think if I'm reading the bill correctly, that those existing mining claims would be untouched.
But just like if you do something on an adjacent property in a residential area, it has impact on the property. Mm-hmm. Those property owners have to be represented in the discussion, and we have to look at what impact it would have on them. And if something's taken away, our Constitution is very clear that you can't take something without compensation. So we just they have to be part of the conversation.
Okay.
Assuming you win on the 25th and Nurse 1 and the 26th, you'd be the least in seniority in the entire Congress. Mm-hmm. You'd have the worst office, by the way. How do you?
I'm not going there for the office.
Yeah, don't do it for that reason. How do you see yourself having immediate impact for Montana's? What kind of committees do you think you'd want to be on, that type of thing?
Well, I have been back to Washington once since January.
Yeah.
I've had a chance to speak to the speaker, and I've talked to him on the phone a couple times since. I've met with the majority leader will be here in Montana on Monday, so I'm building a relationship with Kevin McCarthy. Mm-hmm. I've met with Steve Scalise, the majority whip, and probably a couple dozen other members of the House, and so what I've already started to do is build some relationships there, because ultimately people get stuff done. Policy in and of itself, without understanding what people's objectives are, this is just what I've done in business my whole life. To answer your question about committees, if I inherited Ryan Zinke's committees, I'd be very happy. That's Armed Services and Natural Resources. I did have some discussion. I mean, the cherry jobs for me well, let me back up. The decision on which committees is an intersection of where could my skills, given I'm a business person, an engineer, I've been a chairman of a public company for 8 years. I currently sit on another public company board that has almost 4,000 employees. Where could my skills and experience have the most positive impact? Intersected with the interests of Montana and the opportunities that are available to me in the House. So I would certainly be happy to serve on Armed Services, because such a high percentage of Montanans have served in the military. We have some real issues there related to vets, and also to making sure the resources are there for national defense. And natural resources is incredibly important to us. These are the cherry spots, but ways and means or commerce are areas where I think I could contribute a lot. Usually entering freshmen don't get on those committees, but I'll make the case, and maybe I can earn my way to get on there over time.
How about, key to success there is also your staff. How about staff structure? You're gonna retain most of the staff, bring in some of your own staff? How do
Well,
you-
campaign's very different than running an office.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think if you look at my experience, what we accomplished at Right Now Technology, this is what I've done my whole life, is build teams of people. I'm a big fan of Jim Collins, and you know, one of the things
Level
that,
5 leadership.
yeah, first who, then what.
Yeah.
You know, you got to have high quality people, and the other thing he says is get the right people on the bus. So this is what I've done my whole career. In the 5 businesses I've started, I've assembled teams of honestly very diverse backgrounds, solely based on their skills and their ability to get jobs done. And I'd do the same thing in this spot if I have the honor to serve.
Perfect segue into Washington HR issues that are currently before us. What's your take on the Comey firing, underlying issues, and what the future is going to look like?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of controversy at the FBI, particularly in the last election, with emails are a problem, no they're not a problem, yes they are a problem, and I think, as I understand it, and again I haven't been in the discussions or conversations, the agency, James Comey's leadership had created controversy there. The termination was completely within the president's rights to do that. I think leadership matters, and I've been very pleased with the president's selection so far in all of the cabinet positions and elsewhere, and I look forward to him appointing someone highly competent that'll bring confidence back to that agency. It's an important role, and we need somebody there that we have confidence in.
What's your assessment of Trump's first 100 days?
You know, I'm encouraged. I look at the highlights. I mean, I'm pleased with Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. I think we have somebody who's going to respect the law and not try and legislate from the bench. I'm pleased that Ryan Zinke has been appointed. I mean, the first thing a leader does is assemble a team. There's been, I would have liked to have seen the appointments go faster, but honestly, there's been a lot of obstruction in the Senate, particularly with the approvals. In my assessment, without basis. This is kind of unprecedented. So number one thing I point to is appointments for his cabinet and leadership. I think they're all based on competency, and I'm encouraged by that. Secondly, he's taken a number of executive actions. I mean, I'm pleased that for our ag community, it's still our #1 industry in the state. The waters of the U.S. was a big deal. It was a big federal overreach that confiscated property rights. I mean, we need to protect the environment, but every dry ditch in the state does not need to come under federal regulation to manage it. So Clean Power Plan is another example. I think that we're seeing a little friction internationally, but I think it's a result of us starting to develop a foreign policy that's honestly been a void over the last 8 years. So I'm encouraged.
So I'm trying to formulate this into a question. You know, one of the fears going into a new position is you will fall into line with whatever agenda exists for other groups. I can't, knowing you as I've known you, I can't imagine you kowtowing to anyone.
Yeah.
But how do you balance following the leadership down a path when you think there might be a better approach?
Yeah.
How are you going to deal with that?
Well, I've got to use my negotiation skills. I mean, the commitment I'm making to Montana is that I'll always be on Montana's side. That's why I've been so transparent. I mean, I've released 11 years of tax returns, you know, because I think it should be open. I've said that my wife and I have prospered here. We said if we get elected, I'll put all my assets into a private, you know, into a blind trust, so I'll guarantee to Montanans that won't influence me. I can't be bought. I mean, that's the problem in Washington. You have all these special interests that are pulling strings. It's the reason why I'm not taking any PAC money to the campaign here, because I don't want that influence. I generally align with President Trump and the things he does, but having been married for 29 years, I know two people don't agree on everything. I'll always fall on Montana's side. You know, and he's proposed some large cuts, and honestly, we need to sharpen our pencil. We've been spending too much in DC. But when his budget and Montana's interests come into conflict, I'm always going to be on Montana's side. And I'm willing to cross the aisle to do that. I'll give you a couple of examples. Public lands are incredibly important. I'm in Montana because of public lands. I've come out and said I am for permanent reauthorization of LWCF, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, because it's a tool used by Rocky Mountain Health Foundation and others to improve access and preserve land. That's not something Republicans always support, but it's important to Montana, and I think we need to do that. The president also cut funds to the EPA. I think we probably do need to tighten our belt there somewhat. But the federal government has a responsibility to help clean up Superfund sites here in the state, and I'll fight to get that money here so we can continue to protect the environment. So I'll be a strong voice for Montana, not because I have any particular ideology, but because I want to represent the interests of Montana. The other thing I'll just mention on that regard is that something happens when you go to DC, and this is kind of what you're talking about. You drink the water and then you go native, and it's a scary thing because we've seen it happen over and over again. And that's why I think a House representative or a senator has to take precautions from preventing that from occurring. What I've proposed to do is, A, not move to Washington, D.C., maintain residency here in Bozeman, and commute each week. Also, Congress is in session. Now, I kind of think they ought to work a little more, but they only are in session 2 out of 3 weeks. I've committed that third week, I'll be back in Montana traveling the state, and I'll get to every county every year, because we had an expression at Right Now that the bigger something gets, the farther you are from the truth. And I can't represent the interests of Montana if I'm not out visiting with folks. My trip to Sydney, Montana yesterday was my 31st trip to eastern Montana in the last 18 months. So that's like 2 a month, right? They said to me yesterday they've never seen a statewide candidate as much as I've been out there. And that's not going to change if I have the honor of serving the state.
You often have said the interests of Montana, or you will come down in support of whatever the interests of Montana would be in a situation. I'm not sure that is a identifiable entity, because the interests of the university, for instance, might not be the same as welfare recipients. Mm-hmm. And so can you explain what that means to you, the interests of Montana as a whole entity?
It depends on the issue, and any issue affects a certain subset of the people. I was with the water board in Sydney yesterday, and they irrigate about 75,000 acres. And because of the pallid sturgeon, there's been some discussion about whether they can get a permit to fix the intake. If the intake gets shut down, they lose production on 75,000 acres. There's a set of people that are very keenly interested in whether or not they get the funds necessary to build the bypass to get the pallid sturgeon around the dam so they can get water to their fields. In the case of the example that Dave brought up earlier, the monument, I'm mostly concerned with what people up in the breaks think, and its impact on them. But this is what I've done my whole life, right? I mean, you go to the table if we were sitting in a corporate boardroom trying to decide if you wanted to buy my software or not, you would have certain objectives. Dave might have different ones. I'm trying to find the common ground amongst all of them. You can't please everybody all the time, but my goal is not to further my interests as much as to fairly represent the constituents back here.
How do you measure, after 2 years in office, success? In business, you set goals, you know where you're getting.
Yeah.
A lot harder, I know, in a political environment, but how are you going to try to assess yourself after a couple of years?
Well, if I take a score on the House, the Senate, and the administration, because we're going to be trying to work as a team.
Yeah.
For me, I'm a business guy. I want to see people prospering in Montana and across the country. We've had very sluggish economic growth. nationwide since the recession back in 2008. I think the path there, and this is part of the proposition, is that jobs are created by businesses, and businesses are started by entrepreneurs. This is why one of my core principles is around making it easier for small business and honestly large business to succeed. I'd like to see stronger economic growth in this country, and in particular, I'd like to see stronger growth in Montana in conjunction with preserving our way of life. Now, I know that's a softer kind of a subjective goal, but that's what I'd focus on.
Would you align with any of the coalitions in Congress, do you think?
I got a list of the coalitions. It's 21 pages long. Do you know there's a coalition of friends to New Zealand? I mean, there's all kinds of ones. And I'm not going there to be a particular member of a particular caucus, unless being a member allowed me to further the interests of Montana.
Greg, would you, I know we've talked a little bit about this, and there's, after Secretary Zinke's rise to his current position of, are you interested in staying in Congress in this particular seat if you're elected for this term? Is this a long-term gig for you?
Yeah, and I've said I'll stand for re-election in 2018 if I have the honor of serving here, and maybe well beyond. I learned over the last year, sometimes one door closes, another one opens.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens 3.5 or 4 years from now. But my criteria would be, am I able to, I think the purpose of work is to serve other people. I've done that my whole life in the private sector, and I feel an obligation to serve the state of Montana. And if I thought that I could best further the interests of Montana back in Congress, then I would continue to run.
Okay.
Do you have any fears that Mark Wicks, who we caught a glimpse of in the last few weeks here, might pull some votes from your right?
That's up to Montanans to decide how they want to vote. I mean, I learned, Michael, a long time ago, I only worry about things I can control. And boy, it allows me to sleep a lot better at night.
You've certainly had an opportunity. This is an election where the choices are pretty defined.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that in the time that you've spent with Mr. Quist and the things that you certainly know about his policies, are there things that you agree with him that you think that's a good point for Montana? We asked him that same question, and I'm just.
Well, I'm sure he loves the state. I mean, he grew up here. I don't doubt his desire to want to help. We're so divergent on policies, though.
Yeah.
On gun rights, on immigration law, on military funding, on tax policy. But he's a kind of guy I'd like to go have a beer with. I said that in the debate we had. I personally like him.
Yeah.
I just think he's wrong on most of the issues.
So I'll ask a question. One that we also asked Rob. There have been a number of incidences of hate in the state, between what's gone on in Whitefish, the flyers that were left around, houses last weekend here in Bozeman.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a number of incidences we haven't even heard about. I'm curious, it's been interesting to me that we haven't heard very much from leadership at any level about these incidences, remarkably little, although, different organizations have had peace rallies and whatnot. I'm just curious, if you were to be elected, how
Yeah,
you
it
would
should,
handle this?
discrimination like this or abuse should not be tolerated. We wouldn't tolerate it in our business. I know that Senator Daines came out with a very strong statement against the hate activities up in Whitefish. I think this is where leadership does need to lean in and say, we're just not going to tolerate this in our communities.
Other questions, folks?
Got one. Come with white papers, look at that. Curious, which is affecting coal prices more, market forces involved in non-coal energy or federal regulation?
Both. I think that the price of natural gas, economics is sort of like gravity. right? And the fact that we have abundant natural gas and the prices come down has had effect on coal, but you can't dispute that the Clean Power Plan put a black cloud over the whole industry while it was in place. I'm a fan of all energy sources. I think we ought to be pursuing solar and wind and hydro and coal, all of them, but what we need to be doing at a federal level is having a level playing field, not where we subsidize one and persecute another, because we won't get the best result for the American people that way. We do also have an obligation to protect the environment, but if you look at the data that came from the EPA as it relates to coal, and the Cato Institute actually calculated that. We found that if we shut down every coal-fired plant in North America, between now and the year 2100, the environment would be 0.02 of a degree cooler. And unfortunately, the margin of error on that study was 0.04 of a degree. So needless to say, negligible impact. And in exchange for shutting down just Colstrip, just the 4 plants that are Colstrip, Montana would lose 7,000 jobs and $1.5 billion of economic impact in the state. It's not a fair trade. I mean, we should be protecting the environment, but I'm fully convinced if we used some of the incentives we provide to coal, to wind and solar, to add American ingenuity to coal, we could reduce that impact even further. But at the end of the day, it's got to compete economically, or it should go away.
Well, related to this, I assume you'd be a real advocate for federal funding for quite a bit of scientific research. That seems to be trailing off now. Mm-hmm. What about that? This is certainly a research university that is beginning to feel the effect of the cutbacks.
Yeah, I do think we have a commitment. I think where we've seen each program has to be looked at for its effectiveness, and I think that we, as a company, spent a lot of money on research. We funded projects at MSU and other universities. I think I started my career at Bell Laboratories, which was probably the preeminent research institution in the country when I started there. In fact, they used to hire PhDs. Now, I wasn't a PhD, but they'd hire PhDs and say, hey, just publish a couple papers, and here's the check, you fill in the amount. And as a result, we got the transistor, we got the Unix, we got fiber optics, we got a whole bunch of incredible things. Park Research in California, the Xerox labs. That's where we got graphical user interface, the mouse. These things all came out of the private sector. And I think we ought to be encouraging and incenting research, and particularly private-public partnerships, because the benefit of having the private sector engaged with our universities is that the research is a little more applied, and we get better results faster. That's my view. But again, we have to be very careful about the federal government picking winners and losers. So we need policy that incents research, but what research gets done ought to be tied to its ability to actually have a positive impact for society.
So, Greg, if our letters to the editor are representative of what some concerns are between with Senator Daines and you being friends from the same county, the same city, same background, same company. Do you view that as a negative or a positive for the state?
Well, I think it's a positive. Gallatin County is going to be very well represented. So for your readership in particular, yeah. I think it's a good thing. Secondly, I'd say Steve and I are both engineers. He's the only chemical engineer in Congress. Yeah. Yeah. I'm an electrical engineer. If elected, I'll be the 4th electrical engineer. Again, engineers are trained to solve problems, and we can actually do math. And the fact that Steve and I have been in the trenches together for 12 years means we're a really good team. I think that with us back there, Montana's going to be able to punch above its weight. And I think that'll be good for the state.
Okay.
So back on this values question.
Yeah.
Sometimes it gets articulated about religious points of view and different education approaches. Talk a little bit about how you see that influencing or not influencing how
Yeah.
you judge opportunities or policy issues?
Sure. So I'm a Christian, and my faith is important to me. I think many of us have faiths, and our First Amendment is very clear. It allows everyone to believe what they want to believe. I'm running in part because I'm a Christian, because I feel as a Christian I have a stewardship obligation to the skills that I've been gifted to use them for the benefit of others. Don't confuse that though. I'm not running to force my views on anybody. You know, our First Amendment is very, very clear. Everyone gets to believe what they want. But my desire to serve is born out of my faith. Again, not because I want to force my views on anyone, but because I feel an obligation to serve. I do, you know, if you want to say, okay, what principles are you going to bring to this? I believe a smaller federal government is what our forefathers envisioned. I think that if people get to keep more of their hard-earned, the fruits of their labor, that we'll have a stronger economy. I do believe in states' rights, and I think that better government is local government. So like in education, you brought it up, you know, I'm not a big fan of a lot of federal regulations in education. I think if local school boards have more power and the state can make decisions, we get better results.
Fair enough.
Any other questions, folks?
I'm curious as to your position on, in the appropriations bills that are going to be forthcoming, where does the wall and its huge cost fit in for you?
Yeah, so again, whenever I approach a problem, I always want to come back to the principle. And I think the reason we're having a discussion about a wall is that we have a very porous border on in the southern part of the country. I believe we need to secure our border. I also believe we need to enforce our immigration laws, that the rule of law is important in the country. This is a big contrast with my opponent, who has called for sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. I think a wall is part of the solution. Now, is it the perfect solution for the whole thing? I don't think so. But I would be supportive of, I think it's part of national defense that we have a secure and non-porous border. I think a wall is part of the solution. And I should go back, that's another principle that I should share, is I think the federal government exists primarily for 4 reasons in my view. One is national defense. That's why I think a non-porous border is important. I think it's why we ought to be giving our military all the tools they need and very clear objectives so they can go in if we have to go in, and we should be very hesitant to do it, to prevail and get home safely. Secondly, we need to make and enforce the laws. We don't want people stealing stuff, and we need respect to property rights and these sorts of things. Thirdly, we have an obligation to infrastructure. The federal government does, particularly for things that can't be paid for in any other way. That's the third. And the fourth purpose of the federal government is a social safety net for people that can't take care of themselves. And that's kind of the lens through which I view any policy proposals, is which one of those 4 things does it actually fit into, consistent with our Constitution? Yes, Dave.
To help agricultural business, especially in the Southwest, I gather there's going to be a shortage of student labor because of politics in Spanish-speaking countries. What do you think about a return to a more modified version of the old Bracero program, which is a worker visa seasonal program?
Yeah.
So what do you think about something like that as a solution, both for business labor needs and also for porosity?
Yeah, and I'm not an expert on that particular act, but I have visited with farmers here in the state. I've met with the stock growers, I've met with the grain growers, I've met with some of the spud farmers we have around, and seasonal labor is really critical to them. They can't always get it here locally. I am supportive of guest worker programs if there's a proven need. Some of the difficulties I've heard is, there have been families coming here working on farms in Montana for years, but then somehow the paperwork gets delayed and it doesn't get approved till like August. And it's like most of the work is over. It didn't help. So I don't think government efficiency, those 2 words don't always fit together. So I think we have some programs in place today. What I really like about what the administration is doing is we're putting competent leadership in these places. I think there's a lot can be done within the framework of existing agreements just to increase efficiency. And again, that's not the role of Congress as much as it is the administration, but to the extent that I'm a strong voice for Montana, and can I shine a light in an area that's not working that well? I think we have an administration now that'll go start to fix some of those things.
Anything in closing remarks that you'd like us to know about your candidacy that we've been asked about?
Well, I enjoyed the conversation about the issues, and you know, Nick, we've known each other for
Long
20
time.
years, long
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
and we've raised our family here in Montana. Susan and I, we chose Montana. We built our business here. I think the Gallatin Valley is honestly an economic oasis in the state of Montana,
Yeah.
and to the extent that we had a hand in part of that, I can't claim credit for all of it. I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
And I think you've known me in the community. We've been, Susan and I have been people that have been willing to give and support, whether it's the opera or the YMCA or Shakespeare in the Park and these sorts of things. And that's not enough reason to elect me to the House. But I think it speaks to our hearts and our concern for Montana and the people. And I like working. You know, I like solving really hard problems, and boy, we got a bunch of them back in Washington. So I would love to have your endorsement in this, given it is my hometown. I spent most of my adult life here, and I think as you weigh the impact we've had here, I'd like you to consider the positive impact we've had, and what I could do if I was representing all of Montana, and the positive impact we could have for the communities that aren't thriving the way Bozeman are. So, thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate your time.
Yeah.